So what we're going to talk about communication between designers and developers, and we're going to do this by sharing some recent developments in our working process over the past year, as it's illustrated by 2 projects that both Ben and I have worked on together. And we're hoping that maybe part of this kind of contributes to the ongoing conversations that people are having about pattern-based design, style guide-based design, and contemporary user experience design practices. The two projects that I'm going to be pulling illustrations from during this talk are one for Mass Design Group. They're a nonprofit architecture practice that attempts to create social change through the built environment in areas of health, education, and equity. They build some in the US, but also have built quite a bit in Africa, in specifically Rwanda and Haiti.
North America.
Yeah, North America. It was an interesting project because they had some big requirements for accessibility and performance, being an international audience. Their work is also framed with really big ideas about social change. So the way that they wanted to express their work involved a lot of journalistic and documentary style presentations. And then accessibility, of course, was a big requirement for them. The other project that we're going to highlight is an ongoing project that we're doing in collaboration with Code for Boston and Terravaz. It's called Find It Cambridge, and it's a directory of resources, services, and activities for children and families in Cambridge. And this was also an interesting project in that it required a very large number of content contributors participate in it. Being a directory, it's not going to be managed by one person. All of the service providers are going to have their access to the site. So, this had requirements of accessibility both on the end user side, but also the content contributor side. And in addition to that, all of the content needed to be structured in a way that it could be shareable, and also, the site needs to eventually be able to consume other shared content from other sources. So who are we? I'm Todd Linkner. I run a small independent design studio in Providence, Rhode Island. I've been doing brand identity, user experience design, interface, and interaction design for over 15 years. And I've been working with Drupal for about 8 years on and off. And we are also, if you're interested in some unique bacteria, Ben and I are also recovering from diseases, so I'm representing bronchitis here. Ben, if you can hear him when he speaks, he's coming from the strep team. He's the founder of the Agaric collective. It's a worker-owned Drupal shop.
Is that bootstrap? No, sorry.
Was that, what? He's also the lead author of the definitive guide to Drupal 7. It's a giant, heavy book that a lot of people are probably have on their desks.
Holding up monitors.
Yep, it's really good. It gets your iMac at exactly the right height. Yes, exactly. Yeah, and he's been working with Agaric and developing Drupal sites for over 10 years. He's contributed a lot to, yeah? Yes, yeah, we're recording. Contributed a lot to, the Drupal community, as well as tons of client projects. So that said, after our introduction, you can tell that our perspective is going to be definitely from the side of consultants. We're hired to do work for people. So, some of the things that I'm going to talk about may not apply if you're, internal to an organization, but I think some of them may. The big idea in this talk, I think, is that I'm arguing for a more active role of the designer. I'm arguing that the designer needs to be responsible more explicitly for communicating the design system to both clients and developers than maybe was tolerable in the years when graphic designers were transitioning to designing for interactive media. And I'm also arguing to release developers from having to interpret visual designs and fill in the gaps that aren't explicitly articulated by the designer, and allow them to focus on implementing the design as a system and really spending time on the invisible deliverables that are essential to a project's success. And those deliverables that don't get much credit, but ultimately, in fact, impact the user experience are things like performance, building the site in a maintainable way, polishing the administrative experience, accessibility, and SEO. So we're going to break this into two halves, and I'm going to present the design side of things. Then we're going to and then kind of set up the handoff to development, and then Ben's going to take over from there. So I'm going to start with this quote, which is, I think, some cautionary words that enlighten us to a variety of biases that people have, all the parties involved in the design process may have. And it's that computers have the insidious ability to affect your idea of what is possible. From the client and designer side, I think clients and designers are also users, and a lot of the times in my experience, I see that the preconceptions about design and the properties of browser-based media really affect what people are talking about when they're coming to me as a consultant and asking for things. The worst case is when someone comes to me and tells me specifically they want to make a Drupal site. That's not really something you need a designer for. What we really want to do is kind of reframe that conversation in terms of an effect or in an end result. So something like it would be like describing Google as a website, or YouTube as a site with videos on it. I want to build a site with videos. That's not really what it does. The end result of that is that the effect is beyond the medium. User perceptions of the web are also based on the experience, and anyone in contemporary user experience practice knows that a person usually only has one viewport that they're looking at the site, and that it's really easy to lose perspective of all of the other potential perspectives. You look at it on your phone, that doesn't encompass all of what the site is about. There's also somebody on a desktop, a giant monitor. They might be, blind and listening to it through some form of assistive technology. So, being able to identify your preconceptions and the limitations that the computer are putting on your ideas is a good point. And I think it's good to always be working on the fringe of that and identifying those barriers and identifying how they're affecting the decisions you're making as a designer. I think this is also true for designers and developers in terms of the tools that they use. Heavy tools really affect your ability to objectively respond to seemingly simple requests. I know I've kind of tried to find a way to express design, and I've been through tons of tools. I've tried every prototyping wireframing tool there is, and some of them, it might be let's just change this one thing, and because it means it's like just one stupid word and it's going to take me 3 hours because I have to update it in a billion places, that's a tool that's too heavy. Sometimes I think Drupal is a tool that is too heavy. And I think there are other ways, and I'll explore those in my processes, how to kind of articulate design in a way that makes it easier to use Drupal and really simplifies what Drupal is doing so that we're focusing on the concept of the design. A lot of this came from some of our early interactions with Mass Design Group when we were having our initial consultations. You know, Mass they're Harvard-trained architects. They're obviously at the top of the design field. In their practice, they're pioneering participatory design methodologies, which they employ in developing nations. They're experienced researchers. They're deeply empathetic in their user-centered design practice, and they're very, very clear about their strategic goals. However, coming to them in my initial consultation, it was really clear what their biases were about browser-based media. And in those conversations, they were going through unnecessary steps of trying to translate their ideas into visual design and language about visual design, that because they thought, being a graphic designer, that's what I needed to hear, rather than hearing the strategic goals. And their biases really came from their experience with print-based media. They do a lot of like static presentations. Their biases came from the fact that their current site was in WordPress, which, as it was built, wasn't dealing with structured content. And so, like when they wanted to do layout things, they were talking about visual things rather than talking, functionally, what does it mean when we're making something big, when we're putting out a left, what does that mean? What is the intent of that? So early on, I found it was important that we needed to establish mental models that allowed us to kind of communicate like how the website works, what these structures of content were, and how we could relate these things to the content strategy and the communications strategy. I think for developers, they deal in abstractions all the time. Every time you get a new programming tool that makes something simpler, it's just another layer of abstraction. And sometimes I think these abstractions help clarify themes that kind of unify ideas that need to go between content design and development. And it helps you be a lot more explicit about the intent. So I'll show some examples of the working process and the tools that I developed and to kind of solve some of these issues. First of all, I know there are a lot of like initialisms that people are putting all over their resumes because that's what people want. The most important thing, I think, with user-centered design or user experience designers is that you take the time to experience users. And by that I mean that there are a lot of people that think, oh, we're going to design this thing and make it great because I know all of this stuff about where buttons go. But unless you are actually watching someone use your stuff, it's not really encompassing the user's perspective. So in order to engage users to kind of validate your design and also consider that the clients are often the first users that are going to experience your design, there has to be something for them to interact with. And, there's there's a lot of like kind of nuanced details, differences between what people are calling wireframes and prototypes. And ultimately, I don't think, the terminology is that interesting. The differences are that interesting. For myself, I identified that the purpose of the wireframe is to allow us to experience and learn from the design while it's in process. And I think an important part of experiencing it is to be able to interact with it. One of the beautiful things I think about a wireframe is that it can kind of be a sketch in code. And for that reason, I develop wireframes in code, and they're live things that they people can click through rather than a bunch of annotated documents. A lot of the time, I think static documents like information architecture documents and static wireframes with annotations are too abstract. People don't pay attention to them and ultimately pay the price in the end when they finally do get to the real product. So I started a process of designing, developing wireframes in code, and I have done this for a number of projects, including both Mass and the Find It project, using a static site generator called Jekyll. And one of the great things about this tool is that, you know, if this is a redesign, I'm able to kind of separate the content from the structure of the wireframe. So the content, Jekyll is great because it has structured content, very much like Drupal has structured content. So on the Mass site, their site was a redesign. I began by, you know, running a web scraper, removing all of that content, and then putting it into Jekyll. So our starting point is kind of a realistic inventory of the content we have to work with. It's also, even though it's structured content, I feel like it's more flexible than something like Drupal, where the implication of, you know, changing a field once you've got, you know, 100 nodes can be catastrophic. Jekyll is not that rigid, although at a certain point in time it becomes tedious. So I'll show you one of the Jekyll. One of the main strengths of Jekyll is the ability to mock up content models and relationships between content. And Jekyll has a couple different built-in data formats that I was able to use to do this. A lot of the content in Jekyll is stored in Markdown and HTML files, and then it's, you know, at build time, it's merged with templates. And within those HTML files, you can also have YAML front matter. So this is a way to kind of structure, in Drupal terms, these could either be describing fields, or these could be, you know, taxonomies. That they're, you know, when you go to Drupal, there's a translation. But the beautiful thing about this is that, you know, you can auto-generate pages based on specific fields, and you can actually have, you know, a wireframe that is like way larger in scope than something you could do in, you know, a tool like Acture or Balsamic or something, because it is truly data-driven. This is great because then, you know, the user gets to experience, they can click through it, you have a realistic sense of the scope. It also gives you the opportunity to, we'll go to this slide instead. It also gives you the opportunity to generate like inventories of the content. So, you know, if you're kind of working in parallel where you're doing design work, but you have a content strategy and you have content managers that need to, you know what we need to work on, what do we need to write, we need to hire writers, we need to get photographers. An inventory of the stuff that you have in your wireframe is really valuable early on in a project, rather than waiting for someone to build out a CMS and discover these things, or to do all of this work, you know, separately in a spreadsheet that doesn't necessarily relate to the design documents that we're looking at. One of the things, one of our projects, I mentioned that Mass was a rebuild, so building a wireframe for a new site, or for a site that exists, is an easy starting place because you have some content to base your wireframe on. The Find It Cambridge site was a different situation because it was a new website. So in order to build a wireframe, we needed to solicit some content to test the design with and evolve the design over time. So in terms of tools, we tried two things. One of them didn't work and the other one was amazing. So the first thing we did was try to get Google Spreadsheets. And the way this worked was, you know, being a directory of resources, the project manager would make this spreadsheet and then she sent out links to like a bunch of different places at social services in Cambridge, and then their people would enter stuff, and they would do it so inconsistently that ultimately it just ended up not being useful content because the structure of the spreadsheet is too loose. You can put weird things in it. You can put formatting in it. It's it wasn't really it wasn't accurately structured. So then we moved to this other tool called Contentful, which is essentially like a software service that's like very much like the Drupal backend. So you can mock up your content types with all sorts of different, validated fields, and you can also define relationships to that. And then at any point in time, I could run a script and pull that data down and put it into my Jekyll wireframe. So the wireframe could evolve in two ways. One, we could be testing this content and this navigation with people, and then if we find out we need more content, we need to make changes, that's something that the people contributing this content could do independently, and then we could regenerate. So the iterations were happening on the level of the content, but also on the level of the design, which I think proved to be a very interesting process to validating the decisions in the design. So Jekyll also has some benefits in that, using Markdown, we can also write, I'll let Ben talk about these ideas, but I wrote some plugins and filters for Jekyll that would allow me to kind of mimic the paragraphs module in Markdown files. So this is well, I'll get to that later. But it was pretty cool that like a static site generator could have structured content abstracted from the design, but also be flexible enough to do some of the things that you may not expect it to be able to do. So early on, I talked about having common mental models to bring the content managers or the client and the design and the development together. One of the things was kind of educating the clients in actually both of the projects as to how content management systems work, and in these cases, it was specifically Drupal. And part of the reason was kind of exposing these kind of structural components of the content management system, help them understand how they would be authoring content and how they would be building relationships. If somebody's coming from something like Squarespace or WordPress where the content is authored in kind of a visual, like WYSIWYG way, it's a big jump to ask someone to abstract these fields and say, oh, here's the main image, but why is it above the title in my editing form, but on my phone it's going to come out in a different order. I think that's a concept and an abstraction that is essential for a client to understand, because like a content manager then can kind of use those ideas to compose their content more intelligently. One kind of use case is like where we might have a content entry form for a specific type of content, and there would be fields that would be used in special cases. Like you might use like a specific type of title to send to Twitter. You might use a specific type of title to send to Facebook, and one to go to your web page. And for someone coming from like a WYSIWYG experience there, you don't understand why are we adding this extra data, or why are we putting in metadata that the end user isn't going to see. To kind of appreciate those things and how the relationships are formed using that data is a valuable exercise for the content managers. I also think that in both of these cases, one thing I really strove to do was develop common mental models for responsive design. And in the mass one, I used this metaphor of flow. And this was important to describe the material properties of browser-based media, meaning that nothing is static. No dimension on that page is static. No viewport on browser-based media is static or fixed. What you see is only just one view of what you get. There are so many other perspectives that you're not seeing unless you have like a full device lab and are doing user testing. So this mental model of flow kind of helped explain the design, the mechanics of the design, and it also helped explain how content managers needed to compose their content. When you have responsive design where the layout is significantly different between a phone and a desktop screen, how you compose that content is very important. And there are a lot of factors that the content manager can consider as they're composing it, such as order, the density of content, the emphasis of content, size. So this kind of maybe transitions to how we were kind of employing some of the ideas that are maybe coming out in what people are calling like atomic design or pattern or style-based software design and development. This book by Carl Gerstner it's from 1964, and he's kind of the original Brad Frost. He was a Swiss designer, and this book really was groundbreaking work in methodical thinking for visual design. And what he argued for, in his practice, he argued for designing not just a fixed composition, but a system of design components. And those components, the intent of those was to articulate the purpose of each component, and then also explicitly articulate the parameters of those components and how they could change in various places. So in a design system, you might have something like a headline, and that headline could be represented on the side of a building, or it could be represented on a business card. And the way to have those like consistently function in a design system, there has to be some transformation. The headline on the side of a building is going to be giant. It might need more contrast. It might need different colors because the light is different. The headline on your business card, still relating to that design system, might be smaller type or different colors. So this kind of paired with some of the things we were talking about in the wireframe and exposing the client to the structural way that we build websites with content management system, I think it is about maybe using more of the ideas and metaphors that we have in programming in a different environment. So a design system being a system of structured parameterized components is kind of a programmatic idea. And the relationship and interaction of those is an idea that we have in programming. For example, as I was talking about responsive design and flow, here's a way that this is articulated in HTML and CSS. In Drupal, we accomplished this in with the paragraphs module. We use that in the mass project. But here's a system of layout that we call flow, and this might be how it goes on the desktop. And then that's the transformation for like a phone. You can see on the desktop, you might be able to say that some of these things could be wide, they go all the way across, something could go on the left, something on the right. But when it gets collapsed down to the phone, it needs to go into this single column. And one of the big things that a content editor needs to consider is, like, in that translation, how does that affect the meaning of the content they're composing? Like, if this is something that introduces, this, and that relationship may work on a desktop, when they're put in like a linear way, that relationship might not work, or it might work. So there are things that you need to consider, and you can only do that by understanding how the components of the system work together. So that move to, this is the visual design for mass. A lot of it has an editorial or documentary style, and all of these compositions are really kind of based on components and put together. And looking at this, you could say that these are specific layouts, these are compositions, but the reality is, like, this site is simple in that there's really only one layout mechanism. And Ben will talk about that more with paragraphs. The way, and I'll show you how that works. So if we go back to this diagram of flow, you can see here's flow decides basically what column it is. It's kind of like a grid, but the grid behaves in a different way. And then each of these things could have a component in it. So when someone makes a page like this, they might start out saying, we're going to have a title image, we're going to have a couple of paragraphs, maybe we'll put a carousel here, we'll put a subhead, so here's some paragraphs. But they could easily put those in any order, because that's how the design system works. Just as, like, this is exactly the same edit form as something like this. And that's achieved with the paragraphs module and the design system. Should probably hurry up, I guess. So so after we do the visual design, I need to communicate this to the developers. And for years, I had the perspective that you hired a developer, I'm not going to code your site, you're not paying me to do that, and I don't want to know that much about Drupal, even though I have done it. So I would make these types of style guides where you've got all of the components, you've got all of the whatever important details, but it kind of leaves out quite a bit. It leaves a lot for interpretation. It doesn't tell you whether or not the transition between different states is going to be animated. It doesn't tell you really very well what happens if you have, like, a button on top of a range slider. And this became really clear one moment when I was delivering the design for Find a K-Bridge to Stefan from Agaric. I had this diagram of how the responsive design was going to adapt to the various breakpoints. And it was clear in my mind, but Stefan, who is a very capable front-end designer, he's like, how the hell are you going to do that? I can't figure this out. And I felt like this document was pretty tedious to make, and seemed pretty obvious to me. And this one, A is here, and that way it's there, and there it's there. But it was asking a lot of interpretation on his part. So, I just sat down for like, 15 minutes and wrote some HTML and sent him this goofy HTML file that, had all of that behavior built into it. And then I realized that, this was actually the language that communicated the design best to the developer. And so from that point, I was like, my role as a designer has to extend beyond, the visual theme, the strategic parts, and just making layout. It has to extend to the point where I need to articulate these things in the most precise language possible to all of the parties involved. So we need to communicate to the content manager, the client, and we need to communicate to the developers. So I didn't use pattern lab, but independently we kind of came up with something similar to that, and that these are all HTML-based, static HTML components of the design. And this was what was delivered as a style guide. Each component really was a small amount of markup, a very separate SAS file. And this is something that could actually go directly to Drupal and be incorporated in Drupal. And the great thing about this is that it's not just a picture that says this is what a photo could look like. It's easy to test out how the variations work with their parameters. Like if somebody wanted a square image, it would be very simple to add that variation and be able to test and see what the effects of that variation with the parameters of the component would be. Just typography. So at the end, this slide is not the design. This is the component-based style guide being used to represent the various layouts. So all of these things are just pieces that have been predefined, and they're put together to kind of show and kind of validate that the system works. So part of the benefits here is that it really, having the designer think in code, simplified the code needed to build the design. It was easy to effect a consistent and global change. And Ben can talk about some specific examples that we had to deal with as we moved on. And ultimately, what I ended up packaging for the developers was a package of the wireframe, which since it was clickable and it encompassed like a near realistic scope of the content, it served as a content inventory. It served as an information architecture. And then I also delivered a coded style guide, which makes up the remainder of the handoff. So in the big picture, the design, I've kind of changed my perspective. The design is not the layout. The design is the system, and it's the program. And okay. So that's what I handed off, and now I'm going to hand it off to Ben.
Then cool. So, as a developer, it's fantastic to follow someone like Todd. As a speaker, it's a little more intimidating. But yeah, so it's really, I'm just going to talk about some of the benefits of having a designer who delivers HTML and CSS, who understands the Drupal framework, and who really
that's why it is beneficial to use fields, because you can have that flexibility. So, that being said, fields are used to structure the information that is being stored. You can take discrete pieces of information, and that will allow you to filter and sort that information later. You can collect and display that information in different ways, and you can show or hide fields individually as needed. So, again, with the concepts that we have seen so far, if this were a Drupal page, we are only covering so far the middle screen here. So most of the time, not always, and we're going to take samples later, but most of the time when we go to a Drupal website and we see a page, that page will be a node. So when we see the page, the main content of that page usually will be a node. That node will be of a specific content type, and that content type will have, let's say, 10 fields or figures. So you can enter that information, and you can present it here. So let's say I have the title, I have an image field, I have a tagline field, and I have more fields for this. But what about the things around the main content? The things around the main content in Drupal are called blocks. And blocks, they are containers of extra information to be displayed along the main content of your website. And blogs are placed in a theme region. By the way, slides will be available, so you need to take notes if you don't want to. Before explaining blogs in detail, it is important to understand that every blog will be placed in a theme region. As I said before, the theme controls the appearance of your website, and you can change themes. When you change themes, the regions that will be available are going to change too. So that is important to keep in mind. By default, Drupal comes with a blue theme called Bartik, and the blue theme called Bartik provides this theme region. So anywhere where there is a yellow rectangle, you can place blocks there. And remember that blocks is content. So that is the same as saying everywhere where there is a white rectangle, you can place content there. Let's say, for example, that in your website, you have the main content and a right sidebar, but you don't have a left sidebar. Well, the theme is going to control the appearance. So if the theme is configured that way, it will detect there is no content in the left sidebar, and that space will be collapsed. So the main content, the center of the page, will expand to use that content. Let's say that you have a page that doesn't have any sidebar. Bartik provides that functionality. If you have any sidebar, the main content area in the center will expand to use the full width of the page. Like this is called collapsing regions, and that will depend on the theme itself. For example, Bartik has this at the bottom. You have for the first, second, third, and fourth. If you don't place anything in any of those four regions, that thing will be collapsed. But if you place something, for example, in the third region, it won't automatically expand to everything else. It will only occupy 25% of the page, and the rest of the space is going to be empty. So you need to know what your theme provides. That being said, let's study blocks in depth. So blocks can have static or dynamic content. Static content means that the content that they display is the same always or almost always. For example, the copyright text at the bottom of your website, let's say copyright 2016, that changes once a year. So in nature, that is static content. Or maybe you know, for a conference like this, when we have sponsors, we want to show a banner with a picture of the sponsor in every single page. So that in nature is static. We can also have dynamic content. For example, that is content that changes regularly. The latest blog post in my website, if I publish a new blog post every day, that content will be changing every day. The newest products in my store, if I add products every week, that content will be changing every week. So that is a way to categorize blogs. Blogs can also enforce visibility rules. For example, I can say, this blog is going to be available only for notes of type articles. A use case for this, for example, more articles by the same author. That only makes sense in the article content type. It doesn't make sense in an event content type because event doesn't have authors. So you can enforce visibility rules by content type, by language. If you have your site in English and in Spanish and in French, oh, this blog is only relevant for the French version of my website, for example. You can enforce visibility rules based on pages. For example, this blog is only available in the front page. This blog is only available in the contact page, or this blog is only available in the services section of my website. And then you can also enforce visibility rules based on roles. That is later. Blogs can also be aware of their environment, so they can collect information of the page that they are being rendered on, that they are being displayed, to change the content of the blog itself. For example, more posts from the same author. It will say, okay, I am on node 10 right now. Node 10 was published by Mauricio. I'm going to look for more articles published by Mauricio. If I go to node 11, node 11 was created by Ben. So I'm going to look for more articles created by Ben. It is the same blog. It is only fetching information from its context to modify the information that is going to be displayed. And blogs, in the same way as content type, blocks can have fields. So everything that I explained for fields can also, it also is also relevant for blocks. And an example is that you can have a special offer block where you have a title, a description, an image, and an expiration date. So when you create a block of type a special offer, it will be displayed on the right sidebar every time until the expiration date is, comes. Now, the next step, or a new concept is views. So views is really huge. You can have whole conferences about views and have groups only for views. So I summarize it in 2 slides. A view is a listing of information. Every time that you want to list something in Drupal, you can use a view. It can be a view of nodes, a view of users, a view of comments, taxonomy, and so on. A view is simply a list of something. What does views allow you to do? To scan the content of your website and apply filters and like filter criteria and sorting criteria. And once you have the information that you want to present, you can present it in different ways. For example, you can present it in a table. You can use a view to present the same information as an Excel spreadsheet, or as a CSV, or as a PDF, or as a map, and so on. Once you have the information in your website, you can present it in many different ways. And views in particular is very flexible. You can have many ways to represent the same content. An example of this, in this case, I am showing a table. So I have a content type of name car, and I have different fields. As you can see, I have the play, the year, the make, and the model. And I'm showing that information in one single piece. That doesn't mean that I have one single piece for that. Internally, those can be 4. One field for the play, for the year, for the make, and the model. But when I configure the view, I configure it in a way that those different fields are going to show together. So again, I can collect the information in different ways and control how it's going to be displayed to the end user. I can have images and other fields there. A couple of things about tables with views. I can configure them to be sortable, like the header. Let's say I have a number here. I can click on the header and that will sort by that number. Or if I have, I am showing 5 here, but if I have 50, I don't want to show 50 at a time. Let's say I want to show 10 at a time. So when you can configure how many nodes or content you want to show at a time, and if you have more than that, a pager will appear at the bottom. That is like numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4. You click on those links and you get to the next 10, to the next 10, and so on. This is good, like, for example, for this specific view, I define, okay, I want to show only cars only nodes of type cars, and I want them sorted by year descending, like as you can see, 14, 13, 11, 2008. But what if I want to provide the visitors of my website the possibility to modify that default sorting or that default searching? I can use something that is called exposed filters in view. So the same fields that I use for the initial configuration, I can expose them to the user, and they can search by year, by make, by model, and modify the sorting criteria. So this is called exposed filters. Now, on my left, I have a different thing here. This is also a block that was created with a view. Before I said that a view is used to create a listing of something. Usually when we say a listing, it means more than one. But there are a few cases where a view or a list of one element does make sense. For example, in this case, it's a random element. So if every time that I refresh the page, I want to show a random element, I can create a view with only one element and change this. I want this to be random, and that will change every time. Another use case for this is I want to show the latest product. The latest, this is only one. So I can configure a view to use like the date that the product was added and use that field to sort it like descending and limit the view to show one result only. The net result of that is that it will show the latest product. So there are times where a listing of one element doesn't make sense. Now, why so much theory? This is so boring. I mean, most of these things apply only to Drupal. Why do I need to care about that? Or why do I need to learn about that? The reason is that Drupal loves nests. In particular, we love nesting. So if you know a little bit of HTML, you can see things like this in Drupal. Like in order to print a single line, you have so many levels of markup, most of which is not necessary. And that is in Drupal 8 that is better than before. But that being said, Drupal also nests concepts. For example, if I have a piece of information saying more articles by the same author, like going outwards to the details, every piece of information is content. Every piece of information every content needs to be in a theme region. So in theme regions, I place blocks. Let's say that I created that block using a view. Let's say that view is configured to show nodes of type card. But in addition to that, I am showing only a specific piece of that node. I am not showing the whole thing. So I can nest concepts. I am going to, for one piece of information, I am nesting 5 different concepts. But that can change. Let's say that instead of a list of nodes, I want to show a list of users. Then everything will be the same, but this layer is going to be users. It is possible to create blocks without views. So I can have theme region and blocks, and then that's it. So the importance to understand this is, for one, that there are different layers, but more than that, how they relate to each other. Why? Because if you want to change how your website looks or the information that is being presented, you need to know, I am dealing with a node, I am dealing with a field, or with a view, or with a block. What is this? So you need to know what you're trying to modify in order to modify it. So that is how Drupal recycles concepts and encapsulates concepts one on top of the other. And that is for one block. Let's say this is a page. That whole thing can be only for this block. And the same concept will be used to render this block, this block, this block, and so on. So as you can see, for one specific page, you have so many things going around. And if you want to modify this particular piece, okay, is this a view, is this a node, is this a block, whatever. So you need to know the details. This is the part where I drift from the regular session that I present to focus on design things. So one of the topics that we're going to cover is templates. So in Drupal, we use templates to separate the presentation logic from the business logic. If you know a little bit of HTML, you can mostly understand this. I have some tags, a head tag, a body tag, an H tag for a link, and so on. So in Drupal, we use templates to separate the presentation from the business logic. So the themer, the person responsible to create the look and feel of my website, they write in what they already know, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And they use variables which are here are represented within curly brackets to output information. So for example, if you want to say this node was submitted by Mauricio on January 1st, they will have placeholders for that information. Those placeholders are called variables, and they are used in templates to print information. Now, how those templates relate to what we were seeing before? Anything that you see on a Drupal page is rendered using a template. So again, things start to encapsulate one on top of the other. So if you want to render a node, you will have an HTML template for the whole website. Then you will have a page template, then you will have a region template, like this is the region that I explained for themes. This is a template for regions. Then you have a blog template, then you have the node template, and we can continue going. You can have templates for every specific field. So, in addition to understanding the concept, the way that this materializes in Drupal is through templates. We use templates to render the markup that you will need, and one template encapsulates another one, and another one, and another one, and so on. So as you can imagine, again, you can have, for one single page, 100 templates used, for example. So it's really good to know where things come from. And Drupal comes with many themes. As I said before, Bartik is the blue one that you get out of the box, but there are others. One of those is called a stable, and the stable core theme has 146 templates. So how come can I know what is that template that I need to modify to change the specific markup of my website? Well, in Drupal 8 you have some ways to help with that. You need to enable theme debug. So you can go to this link and you will find information on how to do it. But basically, there is a file called services.yml, and you will find something like this in that file. You need to change debug from false to true, auto reload from null to true, and cache to true. So when you configure this in your website, instructions are here. Then when you go to the website itself, you can inspect the markup, and when you inspect the markup, you will see comments, and those comments will tell you what templates are being used. For example, oh, this is a node, so I know that, like, if it says theme hook node, I know that I'm dealing with a node. If it says views, I know that I'm dealing with a view. If it says user, I know that I'm dealing with a user. So that is a way to find out what themes you're dealing with. In addition to that, it tells you that exactly in your file system what template is being used to render this particular markup. And in addition to that, if you want to modify how this is presented, it tells you different options. Those options within Drupal are called theme suggestions. So if you want to modify how nodes are presented, you can use a template instead of called node. Let's say node dash dash article. And if you are, this article refers to the article content type. So if, let's say that you use the same template for every content in your website, except for the article content type. You want the article content type to be shown differently. So you create a new template, and actually the process is you copy the one with the X, and you copy and you create a new file with the name like this. So for example, if you have in your theme a template just called node and a template called node dash dash articles, if you're seeing a page of, the page is a node of type event, it will use the default one. If you're seeing a node of type articles, it will be it will use this template instead. So that is how you can determine what templates to use. Again, those are called theme suggestions. You can, in this list, you can find more information about them. The one with the X is the one being used. The one with the asterisk are the different options that you have. It is important to note that not all the suggestions will be available, and this is particularly true when you're working with views, because to render one single view, you can have 5 different layers, like the master, like there is the view in general, there is a wrapper, there are many ways to render a view, like at most 5 different layers. So at each layer can have many suggestions, let's say 10 or 20 suggestions. That will kind of pollute the output here or the suggestions here. So they reduce what views provide as theme suggestions, but in this link you can find all the template suggestions for views. So generally this will suffice, but for some specific use case you need to further check a little bit, and here you can find all the suggestions for views. An example, again, like let's say that this is the default template, and I want to modify this template, then I copy the template into my theme, I rename it. If I want to target any specific variation of the thing that I'm rendering, and I just modify. So if you compare this to this, I am changing how this is going to be presented. And again, I can be more specific. So I can say nodes of type articles. I can have another template for nodes of type car, another template for nodes of car event, and so on. If you're not specific enough and there is not a template with that name, Drupal will fall back to the general template. Another thing that is really important is view mode, and view mode is like a prism. So remember, we said that Drupal is a container of information. We store information. So we can collect a lot of information, but we might decide to present it in different ways to different people. Maybe we can show or hide these certain fields. So how do you control that? One way to do it is using view mode. So a view mode is a name group of fields to be displayed. So we're going to see that there is a default view mode, a teaser view mode, text view mode, and you can create your own. So a view mode is a name, and that name is a grouping of fields and the configuration that is going to be used to be displayed. You can find more information here. So for example, this is for the article content type that comes with core. You have the image field, the body field, the tag field, the comment field, and you can say, do you want to show the label, yes or no? What format do you want to show? In cases of images, you can change the image style. That modifies the size of the image that's going to be presented. And so on. Basically, the view mode is, for example, I can configure a view to show nodes using the default view mode, or use views to show nodes using the teaser view mode. So this is just like pre-configuring how information is going to be presented. As I said before, Drupal comes with some out of the box. Some of them you need to manually activate. You do that in the same page. You can follow the instructions here. And you can create your own. For example, if you want to create a slideshow view mode to have different nodes configured in a way that they will appear properly in slideshow, you can create that like custom slideshow view mode, and different type of nodes can be configured like in a way that when that view mode is being used, they are going to be presented the same, even though they are completely different content types. So again, template suggestions. You can have template suggestions per content type, but you can also have template suggestions per view mode. So for example, full here refers to the full view mode. Articles refer to the article content type. And you can combine them. You can say node of type articles using the full view mode. So you can have different templates.
Yeah, I get you.
Just take it away.
I don't know if this is working anymore. Well, thanks for letting us ramble at you for a little while. Yeah. I think the conclusion that I would like to draw is that if designers aren't intimately engaged with the medium, they're not doing their job. And I think that code is not just an inconvenience or something tedious. I think it's a language that you can use to communicate very specific things, and also free up the developers to do a lot of the hard, invisible tasks that really make a project successful. So, thanks. If you have any questions, we'll hang out, but I know we're over time. So.